A streak of green fire tore across the night sky over Meridian Ridge, and only one man was awake to see it. Ryan Walsh stood at the edge of his wheat field, a lantern in one hand, watching the light fall. It did not burn out like a normal shooting star. It slowed down. It curved, and then it dropped somewhere behind the low hills that marked the edge of his land. He should have gone back inside. That is what any sensible farmer would do. But Ryan had spent 10 years working the soil of a frontier world, and before that, he had spent 5 years fixing engines for the Colonial Survey Corps. Curiosity was not something he had ever managed to farm out of himself. He saddled his old work horse and rode toward the hills, the lantern swinging at his hip. The night was cold and quiet, except for the low hum that grew louder the closer he came to the crash site. When he crested the last hill, he saw it, a small, dented pod, barely bigger than a delivery crate, half buried in a smoking furrow of dirt. It did not look like any human craft he had ever seen. The metal was dark and smooth, almost like scales instead of plating. There were no markings, no flags, no colony registration numbers stamped anywhere on its surface. Ryan circled it twice before he found the hatch, and it took him almost an hour of prying with a tire iron to force it open. Inside, nestled in a bed of strange blue foam, was a single egg. It was about the size of a large melon, its shell a deep, swirling gray with faint silver lines running through it like frost on a window. It was warm to the touch, warmer than it had any right to be after crashing through open space. Ryan stood there for a long time, just looking at it, unsure what to do. He carried it back to the farmhouse wrapped in his jacket. The next morning, he rode into town and reported the crash to the colonial office, the same way he was supposed to report anything unusual. Henry Colt, his oldest friend and the closest thing Meridian Ridge had to a lawman, came out to look at the wreckage with him. Henry crouched by the empty pod for a long time. He had served in the militia during 2 border skirmishes, and he had seen strange things before, but nothing quite like this. No markings, no beacon, no registry hit anywhere in the system, Henry said, standing up and brushing dirt from his knees. Whatever brought that thing here did not want to be found. There was an egg inside, Ryan admitted. Henry stared at him. You brought it home? I couldn't just leave it in a field. It's alive, she finally said. Whatever is inside, it's alive, and it's close to hatching. Ryan asked the only question that mattered to him. Is it dangerous? Grace hesitated. I don't know what it is, Ryan. I've never seen a signature like this. But right now, it's just an egg. It's not going to hurt anyone. That was enough for Ryan. He built a small wooden crate lined with old blankets and kept it near the stove, where it would stay warm through the cold nights. He checked on it constantly, sometimes talking to it the way a person talks to a plant they hope will grow, more out of habit than expectation. 3 weeks later, in the middle of the night, the shell cracked. Ryan woke to a soft scratching sound and found the egg splitting open on its own, a small clawed foot pushing through the shell. He knelt beside the crate and watched as the creature inside slowly worked itself free. It was no bigger than a house cat, with silver-gray scales, folded wings still wet and creased against its back, and 2 bright eyes that blinked open and fixed on him immediately. It did not hiss. It did not try to run. It simply looked at Ryan, tilted its small head, and made a soft, curious chirping sound. Well, Ryan said quietly, kneeling in his kitchen in the middle of the night, I suppose you need a name. He thought about it for a moment, watching the little creature shiver and stretch its wings for the first time. Outside, the sky was clear and full of stars, the same sky the pod had fallen from weeks earlier. Sky, he said, that's what I'll call you. The hatchling chirped again, as if it approved, and crawled unsteadily into Ryan's hands. He wrapped her in a blanket and held her close to the stove's warmth, and something in his chest settled, the way it does when a decision has already been made before the mind catches up to it. Word got around town quickly, as it always did in a place as small as Meridian Ridge. Some people thought Ryan was foolish for keeping an unknown creature in his home. Others thought it was harmless curiosity that would fade once the novelty wore off. Henry worried quietly but did not push the matter, and Grace visited often, telling herself it was for research even as she grew fond of the little dragon herself. Ryan did not think much about where Sky had come from, or why her pod had no markings, or why she had been sent alone across open space toward a small, unremarkable frontier world. He only knew that she was here now, and that she needed someone to raise her. He decided that someone would be him. The old barn on Ryan Walsh's farm had a new tenant, and by the 5th year, that tenant was too big to fit through the front door. Sky had grown faster than anyone expected. What began as a creature small enough to sleep in a kitchen crate was now the size of a large dog, with wings that could carry her in short, clumsy bursts across the farmyard and a voice that had shifted from soft chirps into something closer to actual words. She spoke slowly at first, copying the sounds Ryan made around her every day, but by her 3rd year, she was holding full conversations, her accent carrying the same easy drawl as the rest of Meridian Ridge. Ryan raised her the only way he knew how, the same way his own father had raised him. She did chores. She learned to read from old paper books Grace brought over from the town library. She sat at the kitchen table for meals, even though she preferred to eat standing on all fours, and she was scolded the same as any child would be when she tracked mud through the house or stayed out past dark chasing rabbits through the fields. The town, slowly, learned to live alongside her. Children who had once been afraid to get near the farm now ran up the road after school just to see her fly, cheering when she managed a full lap around the silo without stumbling out of the air. Shopkeepers in town stopped staring when Ryan brought her along on supply runs, though a few still crossed the street out of old habit. By the time Sky was 7 years old in body, though she seemed to grow at a rate somewhere between a human child and a much larger animal, she had become simply another resident of Meridian Ridge, as familiar as the grain silo or the old church bell. Ryan taught her the things he believed mattered most. He taught her that hard work earned respect, that a person's word should mean something once it was given, and that kindness cost nothing and was worth everything. He never treated her like a pet, and he never treated her like a burden. He treated her like his daughter, because somewhere along the way, without either of them deciding it out loud, that is exactly what she had become. Not everything about her growing up was ordinary, though Ryan was slow to notice, or perhaps slow to admit what he noticed. There were the dreams. Sky would wake some nights with her wings twitching and her eyes wide, describing a place she called the floating city, a vision of towers built from pale stone that seemed to hang in the air above a shining sea. She had never seen a picture of anything like it, not in any book Grace had brought her, not in any film shown at the town hall on movie nights. Yet she described it in detail, the shape of its spires, the color of its banners, even the sound of bells that rang from somewhere she could never quite locate. There was the way she sometimes spoke a handful of words in a language no one in Meridian Ridge recognized, words that came out of her mouth unbidden, usually right after waking from one of the dreams. Grace wrote a few of them down out of curiosity, running them through what little translation software the colony's old server still held, but nothing matched. There was her scale pattern, too. The silver lines running through her gray scales, faint and simple when she hatched, grew more intricate every year, curling into shapes that almost looked deliberate, almost looked like a design rather than a natural marking. On the nights, she felt strong emotion, fear during a thunderstorm, joy during her first successful long flight. The lines would glow faintly, a soft silver light visible even through her scales. Ryan noticed these things, the way any father notices small oddities in a growing child, but he did not dwell on them. Frontier life left little room for worry over things that were not causing immediate harm, and Sky was happy, healthy, and safe. That was enough for him. Henry visited often, teaching Sky how to spot trouble on the horizon, an old habit from his militia days that he passed along without quite meaning to turn it into training. He showed her how to read the weather, how to move quietly through tall grass, how to judge distance and speed with nothing but her own eyes. She absorbed it all quickly, faster than he expected, and there were moments, watching her track a hawk across the sky with unnatural precision, when Henry felt a small chill he could not explain. Sky herself gave the matter little thought. She knew only the farm, the fields, the town, and the man who had raised her since before she could remember hatching. Meridian Ridge was her whole world, and Ryan Walsh was the center of it. The floating city in her dreams felt distant and unreal, no more important to her waking life than any other dream fades by morning. She did not know, and would not know for years yet, that somewhere far beyond the stars she could see from the farmyard, an empire mourned a princess it believed lost forever, and that the dreams filling her sleep were not dreams at all, but memories, buried deep, of a home she had never been meant to leave. The compass on Ryan's workbench spun in slow, lazy circles for no reason at all, and it was the smallest of the strange things that had started happening around Sky. It began as a joke. Ryan noticed it one evening while repairing a broken fence latch. The old brass compass his father had given him spinning gently on the shelf, even though there was no wind, no motor running nearby, nothing that should have disturbed it. He picked it up, shook it, set it back down, and watched it start turning again the moment Sky walked into the workshop behind him. He mentioned it to Grace almost as an afterthought during her next visit, expecting her to laugh it off. Instead, she went quiet, the way she did when something worried her more than she wanted to admit. "It's not the first thing like that," she said carefully. "The scanner reader in my clinic has been acting up whenever she comes in for checkups. I thought it was just an old machine breaking down. Maybe it isn't." Over the following weeks, more small signs appeared, easy to dismiss on their own, harder to ignore once they started stacking up. Sky began waking moments before dawn without being told the time, as if some internal sense pulled her out of sleep on a schedule no clock kept. She could hear the low engine hum of supply ships passing far overhead long before anyone else in town noticed the sound, tilting her head toward the sky minutes before the ship itself came into view. Once, during a bad storm, she flinched violently and cried out just seconds before lightning struck the old grain silo, as though she had felt it coming before it arrived. Ryan told himself these were simply signs of a creature with better senses than a human, nothing more unusual than a dog that could hear thunder from miles away. He held on to that explanation as long as he reasonably could. Then the survey ship arrived. It came in quietly, landing on the far side of Meridian Ridge under a registry number that did not match any known colonial trade route. Its crew introduced themselves as independent researchers, cataloging unusual wildlife across frontier systems for a private scientific group. They asked polite questions in town, buying drinks at the tavern and asking the bartender, almost too casually, whether anyone in the area had reported an unusually large or intelligent reptile in recent years. Word reached Ryan by that evening, carried by a nervous shopkeeper who had overheard the conversation. Henry showed up at the farmhouse within the hour, his old militia rifle cleaned and loaded for the first time in years. "They're not scientists," Henry said flatly. "No scientist asks questions like that without already knowing the answer they're hoping to hear." Ryan agreed. He and Henry rode out to the edge of town together, arriving just as two of the crew members were quietly questioning a farmhand near the grain depot, showing him a faded image on a small handheld screen. Ryan caught only a glimpse of it before the man pocketed the device, but it was enough. The image showed a creature with silver-gray scales and faint, glowing markings, remarkably similar to Sky, though clearly not a photograph of her specifically. It looked older, and it wore something around its neck that resembled a piece of jewelry rather than a wild animal's natural features. Henry made the confrontation short and firm, informing the crew that Meridian Ridge did not take kindly to strangers asking pointed questions about private residents, human or otherwise, and that their business here was concluded. The crew did not argue. They packed up within the hour and left orbit before nightfall, offering no real explanation for their sudden departure. That night, Grace came to the farmhouse with an old book pulled from the back shelves of the town library, a dusty volume on frontier-era xenology written decades earlier by one of the first human diplomats to make contact with alien civilizations. She had remembered a passage about a symbol, and after an hour of searching, she found it, a small crest, similar in shape to the marking painted on the survey ship's hull, described in the book as belonging to a noble house of a powerful, ancient species known as the Drakari. "They're dragons," Grace said quietly, setting the book down on the kitchen table where Sky could see it too. "A whole civilization of them. Spacefaring, advanced, and old, older than most human records go back." Sky stared at the illustration in the book for a long moment, an old sketch of a Drakari elder standing before a floating city with pale towers and shining banners. Her breath caught. It was the city from her dreams. "That's it," she whispered. "That's the place I keep seeing." The room went silent. Ryan looked at Grace, then at Henry, then at Sky, who was still staring at the page as though she could step through it and into the picture itself. For the first time since the night the pod had crashed into his wheat field, Ryan felt something close to fear, not of Sky, never of her, but of what her existence might mean, and of who else out there might already know the truth he had spent years quietly avoiding. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, the way he had done 1,000 times before when she was frightened as a hatchling. "Whatever you are," he said, "and wherever that place is, you're still my daughter. That much doesn't change." Sky leaned into him, comforted but unsettled, unable yet to shake the growing certainty that her past was no longer content to stay buried, and that Meridian Ridge, the only home she had ever known, was about to become very hard to protect. The sky over Meridian Ridge turned silver, then black, then silver again, and everyone in town stepped outside to see why the sun seemed to be blinking. It was not the sun. It was the shadow of a fleet, dozens of ships descending through the atmosphere in tight formation, their hulls catching the light in flashes as they turned. Nothing like it had ever been seen above the colony before, not during the border skirmishes, not during any supply convoy that had ever passed through the system. Farmers dropped their tools in the fields. Shopkeepers stepped out from behind their counters. Children were pulled indoors by worried parents who had no idea what was happening. Ryan was in the barn repairing a harness when Sky burst through the door, her eyes wide, her whole body trembling. He did not have time to ask what she meant. Within minutes, the largest of the descending ships settled into the open field just beyond the farmhouse, its landing gear crushing a wide circle into Ryan's wheat, engines cooling with a low, deep hum that seemed to shake the ground itself. A ramp lowered from its underside, and figures began to emerge, tall, scaled, wearing armor unlike anything human eyes had seen before. At their head walked a Drakari elder with dark blue scales and gold markings, moving with the calm authority of someone used to being obeyed. Henry arrived at a full gallop just as the figure stepped onto the field, rifle in hand, though he did not raise it, sensing immediately that whatever this was, it was not an attack. The elder stopped several paces from the farmhouse and bowed his head slightly, an unexpected gesture of respect toward the small group of humans standing before him. "I am Admiral Thal, of the Drakari Dominion Fleet," he said, his voice deep and measured, the human words carefully pronounced despite an obvious unfamiliarity with the language. "I have searched 18 years for a lost child of my people. My instruments tell me my search ends here." Ryan stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between the Admiral and Sky, though he knew perfectly well that no human stance could stop a Drakari fleet if it came to that. "She's my daughter," Ryan said, his voice steady despite the fear tightening his chest. "I don't know what you think she is, but she's mine, and I'm not handing her over to anyone." Admiral Thal studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his golden eyes. Then he turned his gaze to Sky herself, who stood frozen beside the barn, her wings half spread as though caught between fleeing and standing her ground. "She is not what I think she is," Thal said quietly. "She is who she is. Her name, given at birth, is Aurelia, daughter of the royal house Aurelius, heir to the throne of the Drakari Dominion." The words landed heavily in the quiet field. Grace, who had arrived moments earlier on her old truck, put a hand to her mouth. Henry lowered his rifle slightly, stunned into silence. Sky said nothing at all, staring at the Admiral as though he had spoken in a language she should understand, but somehow could not process fast enough. Thal explained the rest carefully, aware of how much weight his words carried. 18 years earlier, during a period of political turmoil within the Dominion, an infant princess had vanished during an attack on the royal transport meant to carry her to a safer province. The transport was found destroyed, and for years the Dominion believed the princess had died along with it. Only recently had fragments of old tracking data surfaced, data suggesting an escape pod had launched moments before the attack and traveled far beyond charted Dominion space, farther than anyone had thought possible for a vessel of its size. "I do not come to take her by force," Thal said, looking between Ryan and Sky. "I come to offer her the truth and the choice of what to do with it. My duty was to find her. It was never to decide her fate for her." Sky finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than usual. "I don't understand. I'm not a princess. I grew up here. I've never even left this planet." "You grew up as the person your father raised you to be," Thal said, and there was something gentle in the way he said it, a respect Ryan had not expected from a being of such obvious power. That does not erase who you were born as. It simply means you now carry both. The field fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the low hum of the fleet's engines and the soft rustle of crushed wheat in the evening wind. Ryan looked at Skye, searching her face for some sign of what she wanted, ready to fight the entire fleet himself if that was what she needed from him. "Whatever you decide," Ryan said quietly, kneeling so he was closer to her eye level, the same way he had knelt beside her the night she hatched. "I'm going with you. You're not doing this alone." Skye looked at him, then at Admiral Thal, then up at the massive ship looming behind him, its shadow stretching across the farm that had been her entire world. For the first time in her life, she understood that her world had just become much, much larger and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. "Then let's find out who I really am," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "But he comes with me." "That's not a request." Admiral Thal nodded once, the closest thing to a smile crossing his scaled features. "That," he said, "can be arranged." Regent Voss had ruled the Drakari Dominion for 18 years without ever sitting fully on its throne, and he intended to keep it that way. He received the report from a trusted informant embedded within Admiral Thal's fleet less than a day after the discovery on Meridian Ridge, delivered through a private channel that bypassed official Dominion communication entirely. The message was short. The princess had been found alive, raised by a human family on a minor frontier world, and Admiral Thal intended to bring her home. Voss read the message twice in the quiet of his private chamber, then set it down and stared out over the floating city he had governed in her absence, the same city Aurelia had seen so clearly in her dreams for years without understanding why. He had built his rule carefully during those 18 years, consolidating power under the excuse of guiding a grieving dominion through the loss of its royal line. A living heir threatened all of it. He could not simply refuse Thal's return, not without revealing his own guilt in arranging the sabotage that had sent an infant princess hurtling into deep space so many years ago. But he did not need to refuse it. He only needed to make sure the princess never survived long enough to arrive. Within hours, a small strike team of loyalist agents left Dominion space under a false flag, their orders simple and final: reach Meridian Ridge before Thal's fleet departed, and ensure the girl did not leave that farm alive. Back on Meridian Ridge, the town had spent the day absorbing the impossible news that their quiet neighbor was, in truth, a lost princess of a powerful alien empire. Admiral Thal had requested a short delay before departure, needing time to properly secure diplomatic clearance for Aurelia's return and to formally document her identity for the Dominion's records. It was meant to be a quiet evening of preparation. It did not stay quiet for long. Henry noticed the first sign, an unregistered shuttle dropping fast and low over the eastern fields, running dark with no lights and no transponder signal. He raised the alarm at once, ringing the old church bell that had not been used for anything but Sunday mornings in years. Farmers grabbed whatever weapons they had, mostly old hunting rifles and tools never meant for combat, while Thal's honor guards scrambled to position themselves around the farmhouse. The Voss loyalists struck fast, expecting an easy target, a lost princess with no training and no protection beyond a handful of unarmed farmers. What they found instead was a defense built from years of frontier hardship, human stubbornness, and a princess who had learned to think like the daughter of a colonial mechanic long before she ever learned she was born royalty. Skye, still more comfortable answering to that name than to Aurelia, did not freeze. She had spent years watching Henry train, years learning how to judge distance and movement, years absorbing the quiet confidence her father carried in every difficult moment. When the first agent came through the tree-line near the barn, she was already airborne, using the fading evening light and her own small size to disappear against the darkening sky before diving down and knocking the attacker off balance long enough for Henry to finish the job. Ryan fought beside Thal's honor guard with tools he understood better than any soldier could, rigging tripwires along the fence line, using old irrigation cable, turning a broken tractor engine into cover, using knowledge of his own land that no invading force could match. The Drakari agents, trained for open combat against trained soldiers, found themselves tangled in the unpredictable chaos of a farm defended by people who knew every inch of it. Admiral Thal fought with the calm precision of a soldier who had led fleets for decades, but even he was struck by the ferocity of the human resistance around him. Farmers standing their ground against armored attackers with nothing but tools and desperation, refusing to retreat even when the odds looked impossible. The turning point came when Grace, working from the farmhouse with a portable scanner she had once used to study Sky's strange biology, managed to identify the frequency the attackers were using to communicate. She fed the signal to Thal's second-in-command, who used it to jam their coordination entirely, cutting the strike team off from one another at the moment they needed unity most. Isolated and disorganized, the Voss loyalists began to fall back. The last agent standing was captured alive by Henry near the grain silo, his weapon knocked from his hand by a well-thrown wrench, of all things, an object Ryan had used on that farm for over a decade. Under questioning, the captured agent revealed just enough to confirm what Thal had already begun to suspect. The attack had come directly from Regent Voss, proof at last of the very treachery the Dominion had wondered about for years but never been able to prove. Aurelia stood in the middle of the wrecked field afterward, breathing hard, her scales catching the last light of the setting sun, surrounded by exhausted farmers and battered Drakari soldiers who had fought side by side without hesitation. She looked at Ryan, blood on his knuckles and dirt on his face, standing exactly where he always stood, right beside her. "They sent an army for one girl," she said quietly, still catching her breath. "They sent an army," Ryan corrected her, "for the wrong girl. They forgot she grew up here." Admiral Thal, standing nearby with the captured agent secured behind him, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. "Regent Voss," he said, "has just made the single greatest mistake of his long and comfortable reign. News that travels between stars is always old by the time it arrives, but news of Princess Aurelia's return moved faster than anything the Dominion had seen in a century. By the time Admiral Thal's fleet reached the floating capital, crowds had already gathered along the sky bridges and terraces, drawn by rumors that had outraced even the fastest official channels. Aurelia had grown up hearing stories about this place only in dreams, but standing on the deck of Thal's flagship as it descended toward the pale towers and shining banners, she finally saw it exactly as it had always appeared to her in sleep, the floating city, real and enormous and waiting. Ryan stood beside her the entire way down, refusing every polite suggestion from Dominion officials that he wait somewhere more comfortable. He had promised her he would come, and he intended to keep that promise all the way to the throne room itself if that was where this journey led. The evidence gathered from the failed attack on Meridian Ridge, combined with the captured agent's testimony, was more than enough to formally charge Regent Voss with treason. He did not go quietly. He attempted to claim the attack had been carried out by rogue elements acting without his authority, but old financial records, quietly gathered by Dominion investigators over the following weeks, told a different story, one that traced 18 years of careful, patient theft and manipulation directly back to the Regent's private accounts. Voss was stripped of his title and confined to await formal judgment before the full Dominion Council, a fall from power as swift as it was thorough. The Dominion, so long guided by a steady hand that had secretly been guiding it toward his own benefit, now turned its full attention toward the young princess who had somehow survived 18 years in exile without ever knowing what she had lost. Aurelia's coronation was unlike any the Dominion had seen in generations. Ancient tradition called for a ceremony steeped in strict formality, elders speaking in ceremonial tongues, nobles arranged by rank and birth, no place made for outsiders of any kind, let alone a human farmer from an unremarkable frontier colony. Aurelia broke that tradition without hesitation. She insisted Ryan stand at her side during the ceremony, not in the distant seating reserved for foreign observers, but directly beside the throne itself. When the elders objected, citing centuries of protocol, she answered simply and firmly, in a voice that already carried more authority than her years should have allowed. "He is the reason I am standing here at all," she said, addressing the full council. "Not because he raised a princess, because he raised a good person without ever knowing she was one. If that does not earn a place beside this throne, then I do not understand what this throne is meant to honor." The council relented. Ryan stood beside her as she was formally crowned. Uncomfortable in borrowed ceremonial clothing, far finer than anything he had ever worn on the farm, but standing straight and steady all the same, the way he had stood beside her through every difficult moment of her life. Her first acts as ruling Princess Regent, taken while the Dominion still worked through the lengthy process of formally trying Voss for his crimes, surprised nearly everyone who had expected a young, untested monarch to lean heavily on old advisors and old ways. She ordered a full review of policies enacted under Voss's regency, reversing several that had quietly harmed smaller systems within the Dominion for the benefit of the capital. She insisted on hearing directly from citizens rather than relying only on filtered reports from nobles eager to tell her what she wanted to hear, a habit she had learned not from any royal education, but from years of listening to farmers and shopkeepers speak plainly at a kitchen table on Meridian Ridge. And she opened formal relations with humanity. It was a small gesture by Dominion standards, a single treaty establishing trade and diplomatic contact with a minor human colony that most of the Empire had never even heard of before her return. But for Meridian Ridge, it changed everything. Supply routes opened. Trade ships began arriving regularly, bringing technology and resources the frontier colony had never had access to before. Scholars from across the Dominion, curious about the human world that had raised their missing princess, began requesting permission to visit, eager to understand the culture that had shaped her so differently from anyone else who had ever sat upon that throne. Henry, somewhat reluctantly, found himself training a small group of Dominion soldiers in frontier tactics, the same tricks he had once taught a curious young dragon in a farmyard now being studied seriously by an Empire's military. Grace was invited to consult with Dominion scientists on human and Drakari biology both, her old notebook full of careful observations suddenly treated as valuable research rather than a quiet hobby. Ryan returned to Meridian Ridge eventually, though not permanently. He split his time between the farm that had raised him and the floating city that now needed him in ways he had never expected, visiting Aurelia often, watching from a respectful distance as she grew into a ruler who listened before she spoke and thought of her people before she thought of her own comfort, exactly the way he had raised her to be. On quiet evenings, when the demands of the throne allowed it, Aurelia would join him on the terrace overlooking the capital, the same view that had once existed only in her childhood dreams, and they would sit together in comfortable silence, father and daughter, farmer and princess, two worlds bridged by nothing more complicated than years of love neither of them had ever questioned. "Did you ever think," she asked him once, watching the sun set behind the pale towers, "that a wheat farmer would end up shaping the future of an empire?" Ryan smiled, the same tired, steady smile she had known her whole life. "I never set out to shape an empire," he said. "I just set out to raise my daughter right. Everything else just happened to come with it."